Hello and welcome to the latest in our series of independence webcasts ahead of next year's referendum on Scotland's future. With me today are two journalists who've covered every twist and turn in Scottish politics since devolution in 1999. Allan Cochrane, Scottish editor of The Telegraph, who has written on the benefits of the Union, and Andy Nicoll of The Scottish Sun, whose paper came out in support of the SNP's Alex Salmond at the last Holyrood election. I'll be taking their views on the referendum campaign and also putting to them some of the questions you've been sending in. So, Allan, Andy, good afternoon to you. Thanks very much for joining me. First of all, you two are the doyens of Scottish political journalism. We hear from you a lot. It's interesting to hear a bit about your background. So, first of all, Allan, where did you start off in journalism? I think you had quite a long career at Westminster before you came back up to Scotland.
Yeah, that's right, Andrew. I think you're very fortunate today. You've got two ex-pupils of Grove Academy and Broughty Ferry, both slightly overweight and both with beards and both with specs. The similarities end there. I left the Grove when it was still a good school, and basically started in Glasgow on the started in Dundee on the Courier, the People's Journal, Sunday Post, then Glasgow, Scottish Daily Express. When it was shut, I went to London for 20 years on various papers, most of which were spent in the House of Commons, working for variously the Daily Express, Mail on Sunday, Sunday Telegraph. Came back here in '94. I had a couple of wilderness years living in a cottage in the Glens of Angus, and then ever since then, just to prove that I must have done something bad in a previous life, I've been covering the Scottish Parliament.
And Andy Nicoll, also a Dundonian, city of jam, jute and journalism. Where did you start off in your career, and did you imagine that you could be covering this story, the independence referendum, in Scottish politics when the Parliament opened in 1999?
Well, I started off in that big red building you can see just over my shoulder there, the home of DC Thomson's. That was 30 years ago. And I was at the Courier for 18 years. I've been doing politics, first of all with them since '92, and then with the Sun since, the time of the referendum. Did I ever think I'd be doing this? No, not really. I never thought that the SNP could make the headway they have made. There was a day when they were a strange little fringe group like UKIP, and look what happened to them.
Allan, do you think you'd be covering Scottish politics, this particular story in Scottish politics?
No, I'm bound to say I agreed with Andy. I mean, I did say, and the Nats keep reminding me of this, I did say if they ever won, I'd be on the last helicopter out of Edinburgh. I still
don't go back on that.
I still will be if they win the referendum, don't worry.
Right, OK, let's look at a big debate we've been having this week in Scottish politics. It's the online debate and the online abuse that some people have suffered, and Susan Calman, the comedian, comes to mind in this. Allan Cochrane, what do you make of the debate online when it comes to the independence referendum?
Well, I don't think it's a debate as such. It's just a load of daft nationalists shouting at each other most of the time, or shouting at people who don't agree with them. I don't think it's a debate. It's just abuse, and we now discover that Nicoll Sturgeon has had death threats. I'm about to say that took me by surprise. I wasn't aware of that. But if Nicola says she's had death threats, obviously I believe her. But I mean, the main culprits in this, it's not a debate. I repeat, it's not a debate. It's just abuse from the nationalists.
Well, Andy Nicoll, what's your view on it?
Well, I concur. In my experience, it's very much one-sided, and I expect now my Twitter feed will fill up with people abusing me and saying no, it's not. It's an appalling aspect of this whole thing, which has been made possible by the advent of the internet. You know, people, Allan knows in the past we used to get letters written into newspapers on the inside of cornflakes packets by people who weren't allowed to use sharp points or use coloured crayons. Well, now they've got access to the internet and they just pour this bile out all the time, and it takes so much less time than to write a letter in crayons. And
it's also anonymous, and they can do it because there's nothing else to do, sitting in the darkness of their pathetic wee houses in the middle of the night, and it's all anonymous. That's the worst thing about it.
Now, you say it's not a debate, but of course the SNP have been pointing out today, they've been calling for a fair debate, as has Douglas Alexander from Labour. But the SNP point out that their senior figures also do get a lot of bile, on the internet.
Nicoll Sturgeon says she's had a death threat, and as I say, I believe Nicoll Sturgeon. I haven't heard of any other nationalists getting the sort of abuse that the nationalist opponents get. I mean, if there are other nationalists who are getting death threats or the type of abuse that unionists get, then let's hear about it.
Right, OK, well, let's move the debate on now to some of our viewers' questions. First of all, from Lorne Christie. In the event of independence, how do you think Scottish trade with England would be affected? Andy Nicoll, how do you think trade would be affected?
I don't think it'd be affected badly, truthfully. I've never succumbed to the notion that people in Kent would stop buying Tunnock's caramel wafers because Scotland's an independent nation. It's just ridiculous. And
Allan?
No, I don't think there'd be much difference at all. I don't think that is an issue in this, in the referendum debate about whether cross-border trade. I mean, look at Andy says Tunnock's caramel wafers. I can't imagine the same people in the pubs of Kent will stop drinking Bells or Grouse either. I mean, it's just we will continue to buy. I don't know, what do they make in England apart from Maples and Morris dancers? The buses, trains, everything will carry on as is. It's not a part of the debate, I'm afraid.
OK, well, let's turn to what probably is maybe a part of the debate. Been a big debate recently just about currency, what kind of currency we might be using if there's an independent Scotland. Question from Chris Gallen. I'm dismayed at the prospect of Scotland going it alone with its own currency. He says, if it comes to it, I suspect that many older people will place their savings in sterling bank accounts south of the border. What impact would such a move have on Scottish banks and the Scottish economy? Andy, a huge debate about currency. Can you reflect that in Chris Gallen's question and in the wider debate as well about currency?
Well, I really do think this is the huge brick wall that the SNP campaign has run into in the past couple of weeks. Allan and I are both old enough to remember when the position was, don't worry, everything's going to be okay, we don't have to frighten the horses, we'll just slip into the euro and carry on from there. And then the euro went on fire, and the answer to that was, well, when I said the euro, I meant the pound. But the thing about the pound is that Osborne has already said loud and clear that it's not in the interest of the continuing UK to be somehow thrilled in this economic arrangement with a foreign country. Now, Alex Salmond might quite rightly protest that, well, it's our pound too, but if you can't persuade the Bank of England of that point of view, I just don't see where he goes with it.
Well, Allan, that's a fair argument, isn't it? That the nationalists can say, well, it's our pound too. It's equally as much our pound as it is England's pound.
Sure, and it's also Wales's pound and Northern Ireland's pound, and the First Minister of Wales has written to the Chancellor saying, don't let the jocks in on our pound. I mean, it's part of this astonishing degree of lethargy, or maybe it's just arrogance on the nationalist part, that all of these things, these assumptions that Alex Salmond has trotted out over the years, that they would just somehow come to pass. And they didn't think anyone would argue with them. They didn't think there would be a counter-argument put. And when people put the counter-argument, the pound's a good example, so is the argument on pensions, they're astounded. They haven't got an answer. I mean, they've had decades to work these answers out, but they've decided not to bother because they've assumed, wrongly as it turns out, that the Scottish people would just accept whatever Alex Salmond says.
It's not just the Scottish people, it's the government of England, effectively, that they would go along with it. So first of all, we're in a position where people in Scotland have voted to say, get lost England, and then, by the way, would like to share the pound with you. Why would they?
So, Andy, Allan was talking about Mr Salmond, as he put it, trotting out assumptions. Your paper, of course, supported Mr Salmond at the 2011 election. Just what's the Sun's kind of current view on the SNP and independence?
I'd be lying if I said I knew. You know, we take the view that there's a year and a half to go, and that's a decision that will have to be made much closer to the time. It isn't now. Right.
Okay. So it's still kind of considering the position.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Let's turn to another question, which is linked to currency. It just came hot on the heels of the currency debate. It was pensions from Andrew Clark. My question is, having worked within the NHS for over 20 years, would an independent Scottish government put at risk my superannuation/pension in the future? Allan Cochrane, what about pensions?
I think this is the big one. I mean, I think it's when you have arguments about the EU and the pound, important though they are, they're all a bit sort of airy-fairy, but I mean, pensions really hit home to everybody. So first of all, we had the leaked paper from John Swinney, the Finance Minister, questioning the affordability of state pensions. And now we've got an incredibly prestigious Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland raising serious questions about the both state and the situation of both state and private pensions. Now, our questioner is very fortunate to be in the public sector with a good NHS pension coming up, and I think, I hope his pension's safe. But I mean, it's for Alex Salmond to answer that question, I think.
Well, Andy Nicoll, I was speaking to Mr. Swinney, the Finance Secretary, about this on a Sunday programme, and he was saying, well, we've got these cross-border arrangements which work with Ireland very well, and he was hoping that could just work in a very similar way after, you know, post-independence for private sector schemes. Not that wouldn't be an NHS scheme.
Well, you put your finger on it there. He's hoping it will work in a similar way. What if it doesn't? You know, I agree with Allan. You know, this is not the first SNP government to be considering a referendum. This is the second SNP government to be considering a referendum. They were elected exactly, 6 years ago. And it would appear that they've started thinking about this pensions issue this week. It's just bizarre. You know, when we went to the First Minister's questions yesterday, Alex Salmond was taking questions on this, and he was saying, oh yes, well, the Institute of Chartered Accountants has come up with this plan, and it offers 3 possible solutions. And we're considering all of those, and we'd like to talk to London about them. And at briefings afterwards, we were told, yes, we're considering all 3 options. So, since that report came out, the Scottish Government has started considering all 3 options for what might be the future of pensions in Scotland. And it just seems utterly bizarre that at this late stage in the game, this has occurred to them. Maybe, I don't know, maybe if that report had not come out, they wouldn't have noticed. And who can say? But apparently nobody's noticed until now. Now, Allan also made a very good point. Contained in that ICAS report, there is a statement on unfunded public sector pension liabilities, not just in Scotland but across the UK. And there's £856 billion of unfunded public sector pension liabilities within the UK. So wherever you go, your pension's looking pretty shaky.
Right, I just want to pick up on that point, Alan. There's another question from Hugh Devlin. What will happen to all of the NI contributions made by Scots? Will we all receive a full Scottish state pension on retirement, or will that money reside in Whitehall? It kind of, Alan, it kind of fits in with what Andy's saying about the liability, and of course maybe it fits in with Scotland's share of the national debt and so on.
But Andrew, I ain't an actuary, nor am I a pensions expert. I mean, I think these are questions that Alex Salmond and John Swinney have got to answer. One would hope that these things would be safe. But the point is, the fact that there's a question mark and people are asking these questions is the reason the Nationalists are in such trouble, because they haven't addressed them up till now. As Andy says, we've been talking about this not just since 2007. The Nationalists have been talking about independence forever, for as long as I've been alive, forever.
That
and
is
they
a long
still
time.
don't have, I know it's 63 years, and they don't have the answers. We shouldn't have to, people, your questioner shouldn't be putting these questions to me. He should be asking his SNP, MP and MSP. But I bet they don't have the answer.
I would like to add, however, there's bad news for your correspondent there, because there are no national insurance contributions. They are spent as soon as they come in. There is not now, and there has not been since the Pensions Act of 1908, any kind of pot saved up. The money is used all for current spending. So every time you pay your national insurance contribution, that's gone in general taxation use. It's not reserved for pensions. It's not saved up for your pension. There is no pot.
Yeah, OK, let's move on to another issue, which was another really big issue. We've got pensions currency. It was Europe, the future of Scotland in Europe as well. A question from Andrew Ferguson. Would Scotland remain in Europe if England votes to leave in the next Parliament? Would Scotland consider leaving Europe altogether? Allan?
Well, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Well, wait a minute. First of all, before we get to Britain voting on Europe, we've got to have a referendum on Scotland staying part of Britain first. So, I mean, it's a bit cockeyed, this question. I mean, so let me think. So, the assumption is Scotland leaves Britain, and then what happens after that, Andrew? So,
he says, would Scotland remain in Europe if England votes to leave in the next Parliament? So, I mean, I suppose it depends. I suppose it depends if there's a yes vote in the referendum,
yeah,
really.
So it's, okay, let's assume that for a second, a very unlikely prospect. So Scotland leaves Britain, and then maybe, still a maybe, although after this local election result, maybe it's a bigger maybe. So then England votes to whether to stay in the EU or not? Well, for that period, Scotland will be negotiating to get into Europe. Never mind coming out of Europe. It'll still be negotiating to become a member of Europe, according to no less a person than the President of the EU Commission. So I'm afraid the questioner, there's too many ifs there to give him an answer, I'm afraid.
Andy Nicoll, where do you stand in the question about Scotland's role and membership of the European Union? I mean, Allan quoted Barroso there, the President of the Commission, but there seems maybe to be an assumption that Scotland would, if it did become independent, would inherit, would stay a member, wouldn't have to renegotiate.
Well, as Allan has pointed out, it all goes to the timing of these various referendums, general election, possible further referendum votes. Now, let's go with the idea that Scotland votes to be independent. There would then be a period before independence came into play, and the plan is, as far as Alex Salmon says, that that would happen at the next Scottish general elections in 2016, and there would be an Independence Day then. Now, I don't accept the idea that there is automatic EU membership, and neither any longer does the SNP. They've admitted now there'll be a process of negotiation. But it would seem impossible to me that Scotland would not be a welcome candidate for EU membership. So you're talking about a situation where, in those 18 months, when we are still part of the UK and therefore still a member state of the EU, we would then have to spend 18 months, apparently, disentangling ourselves from Europe, only then to begin another 18 months or so, or however long a process, of re-entangling ourselves with Europe. And I just don't think that makes sense for any of the parties involved. You know, at what time are the Europeans likely to say, right, you're not in Europe anymore, and we say, fine, can we have our fish back? And all these Poles, send them back because they're now illegal aliens? It's just not going to happen. You know, we're so intertwined and enlaced. I can't. Surely they would find some pragmatic solution, in the same way that millions of East Germans suddenly became EU citizens. We who are currently EU citizens would find a way, pragmatically, politically, to remain EU citizens.
And Allan, that's a fair point, isn't it? When it comes to a lot of these questions, people maybe look at it in terms of EU law and that kind of thing, but actually it has to perhaps be looked at in a pragmatic, political way.
Oh yeah, I don't dispute that Scotland would be welcomed. I mean, look, the EU exists to further democratic government, and Scotland would, whatever happens, it would have a democratic government and would get in, but it would have to. It wouldn't just walk in. It wouldn't remain a member. And this is what as Andy says, the nationalists have finally accepted after ages, years of blethering about how we would remain a member. They now accept, sorry, you've got to start from here. You've got to start from scratch again. But of course we'd get in eventually. OK, let's turn our attention now to another topic which underpins a lot of these discussions about currency and EU membership. It's the black gold off the North Sea oil. A question from Max Stevenson. I would possibly be in favour of an independent Scotland, but there are a lot of issues which are unclear. I'll just kind of paraphrase what he says next. It's about the UK continental shelf and oil resources. How can Scotland rely on oil revenue if nothing has been agreed? If nothing has been agreed, then surely the SNP are speculating. Andy Nicoll, the oil argument does underpin a lot of the Yes campaign, doesn't it, in terms of Scotland's future prosperity? Yeah,
and I assume the correspondent means regarding what would be Scotland's territorial share.
Geographical share, yeah.
Of the oil wealth. Yeah, well, there is a big issue about that. Since in 1999, Westminster relocated the border to someplace off Carnoustie in order to just take a huge tranche of the North Sea out of what was previously the Scottish sector. And it was previously quite easy to decide upon because, of course, Scotland and England has a separate legal system, so they had to decide way back when if somebody was murdered on an oil rig, would they be subject to Scots law or English law? So all that stuff was divided up. But as I say, in 1999, an enormous tranche of the North Sea was redrawn on the map. Now, I imagine that would be the subject of lengthy and prolonged negotiations during the breakup as to where the border is. But there is no doubt that the vast majority of the oil resources are in the Scottish sector. Tavish Scott, on the other hand, would have you say, well, the vast majority are actually in the Orkney and Shetland sector.
Yes. So, Allan, listening to that, it's a fair point that Scotland does have a lot of oil resource and could be a very wealthy country, couldn't it? That's what the Yes campaign often say. What's your opinion on that?
Well, yeah, I agree. Scotland has massive natural resources, of which oil and gas is but one, and I'm perfectly happy to acknowledge that. I'm also perfectly, but I, as a unionist, am perfectly happy to share that largesse or that bounty with the rest of the UK. After all, the earnings in the City of London are shared with the rest of us. The tax revenue from the rest of the UK is shared with Scotland. So I'm quite happy to share the bounty of the North Sea with the rest of the UK. And as Andy says, whether the border's off Carnoustie or not, it's more likely to be a problem if it's north of Nicoll, because the oil is in north of Shetland, and the Shetlanders are not very keen on a Scottish government. As far as I'm aware, if they're happier to be run from in a UK basis, and their second choice would probably be Home Rule for Shetland and Orkney. But I think that the problem the Nationalists have got is, again, as John Swinney revealed in that leaked paper, was the volatility of oil and gas revenues. And you can produce 20 experts in this field, and they'll come up with different figures as to how much it's going to be worth in 20 or 30 years' time. It's a volatile commodity, and you cannot base what would effectively be a quarter of your GDP on one commodity.
This is not really a problem which occurs to the people of Saudi Arabia, of course. You know, their oil is also equally volatile. It makes up a much larger section of their GDP. They seem to struggle by.
Allan, that's Allan, that's perhaps a fair point from Andy. I mean, this is certainly an opinion.
No, it's not. It's not.
For those who support the Yes
campaign. It's not a fair point at all.
That perhaps you're doing down a very rich resource in
I'm not
Scotland.
doing it down. I'm admitting it. And you can't compare Saudi Arabia with Scotland. I mean, there's no democracy in Saudi Arabia. All the oil goes into the pockets of about 10 people. I mean, is that what Andy's suggesting we should do here? Give it all to Alec?
Well, Andy, I'll let you pick up. Maybe not that point, but I'll let you pick up on that.
No, I'm not suggesting that by any means. But the idea that volatility is such a big deal. Again, I was off when we did counting, but it seems if oil prices can go up as well as down, then there'll be times when it's up and there'll be times when it's down, and you sort of try to tread the middle path between those two.
Allan, of course, you said that you're happy to share the resource, but of course there is an opinion among supporters of the Yes campaign that that's a resource that has been wasted, and that an oil fund could have been set up in the late 70s or early 80s to try to save some of that money for the future.
Well, I was in the House of Commons when Gordon Wilson ran the very successful It's Scotland's Oil campaign in the 70s, and it did work for the Nationalists. But the oil revenue, you can't spend it twice. The Nationalists seem to think you can have an oil fund and also increase public spending. Now, the money, oil and gas revenues that have come out of the North Sea thus far, I think have been used. Could have been used better, but they haven't been used that badly. There was a reconstruction of British industry. Andy's probably going to say the reconstruction consisted of its elimination of manufacturing industry. But I think oil and gas revenue was used pretty well by the successive Conservative and Labour governments. I think the problem is manufacturing industry was ignored too much. But again, I repeat, I am happy to share the bounty of Scotland with my neighbours in the rest of the United Kingdom. I am not a selfish nationalist.
OK, Andy, a question from Alex Heron on independence. Why has no one explained to me exactly what is in it for me? I want to know in exact terms, what's in it for me? Can you explain to Alex what might be personally in it for him?
No, I don't know what his interests are. I don't know what it is he's looking for. Look,
perhaps in terms of being better off.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I was about to say there was a poll some time back which said that people were generally opposed to the idea of independence, and then the pollster said to them, "If you were £500 a year better off, would you vote for independence?" And they said, "Oh yeah, we would." That's a ridiculous idea. You know, to make a decision like this based on something like £8 a week is just ludicrous. You know, this notion is far bigger than the price of a Greg's pasty every day. It's just just nonsense for people to try to make some sort of arithmetical calculation based on these tiny figures. Now, I can't advise this gentleman what he thinks would be good for him. You know, if the sell that the SNP and their independence partners are making is that we could take a different path, that we could make different choices about how Scotland is run and the kind of country Scotland is. Maybe, in the light of today's election results down south, that might start to gain some traction, because there appears to be, politically, a very different point of view north and south of the border regarding left and right-wing politics. But really, anybody on either side who's trying to make this calculation on the basis of a few pence in their pocket, I would advise them to think again.
OK, so, Allan, it's more of a matter of the heart, maybe, than the head when it comes to...
very much. I subscribe to that. But I'll tell you what your question, what's in it for him. Doubt. That's what's in it for him. Doubt in every aspect of his everyday life. There'll be a huge question mark over it all. And, sorry, the second half of your question, Andrew?
Yeah, heart or head, really. I mean,
sorry. Yeah, I'm a great believer in the emotional argument here. I'm a very happy Brit. I've got 2 kids living in England, 2 kids living here. They're all Brits. I don't want them to be foreigners to each other. That's putting it at its most simplistic. I accept that. And an intellectual like Andy Nicoll won't enjoy that argument. But I mean, that's what I feel.
I think that's very valid.
I want to feel.
I think that's very, very valid.
Okay, but there's Allan, you mentioned doubt, and doubt or uncertainty have been a couple of words that have been cropping up. There's a question from Dave Griffiths. How much forward planning has there been, and when are we going to hear what it is when it comes to independence? Andy, there is maybe a sense of uncertainty about what it means, but perhaps it's not just the blame can fall on the Scottish Government, the blame can fall on the UK Government too, perhaps, because they say they won't pre-negotiate. In fact, that Scottish, the House of Lords Committee, the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee, it was almost a plague on both your houses because they wanted both governments to come forward with more information.
And that's a point that's been made too by the Electoral Commission, who sadly are not able to sort of legally enforce that kind of thing. I don't know. I'm not privy to this stuff. As Allan and I were discussing earlier on, it seems astonishing that we've got to this stage in the game and the pensions issue is only just sort of popping up. And you would have thought somebody might have been taking notice of these kind of things and the currency thing and whatever. Down south, there have been repeated statements that the government is making no fallback position for what might happen with nuclear weapons, for example.
So which government? The Scottish Government is making
no down south, the Westminster Government.
Westminster, right.
They're in charge of defence and they have their bases in the Clyde. But apparently, according to Philip Hammond, no, we're not working on the basis that we might have to find something else to do with our nukes. The way the polls are going, he's probably quite right not to waste the time doing that. But as you say, a plague on both your houses.
Yeah, Allan, what do you make of that? I mean, do you think it should be for the Scottish Government to come forward with these ideas and suggestions, but they say, well, we need to debate it with the UK Government, who say they won't pre-negotiate, so that the debate kind of comes to a juddering halt at one point?
What Alex Salmond and his merry band would love is for senior ministers on both sides of the border to be sitting around a table negotiating the breakup of Britain. They're not going to do that. It is incumbent upon the nationalists, the separatists, to put their case to the Scottish people. The last thing the British government, the UK government, needs to be doing is to be seen negotiating away the 300-year-old union. So I'm afraid it ain't going to happen.
On the other hand, sorry.
No, Andy, no, on you go.
On the other hand, we have had interventions recently, and there's more coming, about things like the currency recently, and then before that, a bizarre intervention from the foreign affairs aspect of it, when they said there's 14,000 treaties that would have to be disentangled, stuff about human sacrifice and beheading in Dahomey and the border of Alaska and all that sort of stuff that Scotland would have to renegotiate. It's utter rubbish. But there's thinking going on to examine the many barriers, but there's no thinking, as far as I can see, that's going on as to what if. And Allan has said quite rightly, why on earth would they?
OK, let's just finish in a very quick final one. A question from Malcolm McCandless. Since people have such a low opinion of journalists and journalism, even lower than politicians, why should anyone believe, I'll paraphrase here, a word they read? Allan, first of all to you.
Well, it's a free country. If they don't want to believe me, don't read it.
OK, Andy?
I couldn't agree more. You know, we who live to please must please to live, and if you don't like it, don't buy the papers.
OK. Andy Nicoll from The Sun, Allan Cochrane from the Daily Telegraph, thank you both very much for joining me. And that's all we've got time for on this special Independence webcast. But for more on the Independence debate, including background analysis and the latest developments on the story, go to the BBC Scotland News website and click on Scotland's Future. From all of us here just now, bye-bye.